Hi, everybody, and welcome to Phillips Manor Hall State Historic Site for our history lecture series sponsored by the Friends of Phillips Manor Hall and Tompkins Bank. Tonight, we have our speaker, Peter Bunten. Peter is the executive director of the Mid-Hudson Antislavery History Project, located in Dutchess County. Peter is also the current vice president of the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State and a trustee of the Dutchess County Historical Society. Before his retirement in 2018, he was the education manager at Historic Hudson Valley, and he has a master's degree in historical studies from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, with an emphasis in public history. Peter's talk tonight is called Aspects of Emancipation, Quakers, War, and Runways in Westchester County, and I'm very excited to welcome Peter Bunten. Thank you, Peter.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, so much for this opportunity and for this great location at Phillips Manor Hall. And I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. As Sarah mentioned, the title is, we'll discuss three aspects, or perhaps you could call them movements in the struggle for emancipation. These are self-emancipation, the struggles of the Quaker community to come to a position and action on the issue of enslavement that was consistent with the precepts of their faith. And then finally, the opportunities and choices for freedom and dangers that confronted free and enslaved black people during the Revolutionary War period. And I'll examine the ways that these three aspects played out within and had an impact on the people of Westchester. The central theme running through this story is resistance to oppression. Enslaved men and women were exhibiting their agency to fulfill their desire for freedom. In the case of the Quakers of Westchester County, and helping to end the grip of enslavement within that religious community. The first enslaved Africans were brought to New Netherland in 1627, and it would be another 200 years before New York State abolished hereditary or chattel enslavement, though bondage didn't completely end until around 1840. And when the British took over the colony in 1664, renaming it New York, slavery had been somewhat inconsistent under the Dutch rule, in some cases harsh, but in others relatively lenient. For example, some enslavement was considered temporary. But under the British, a more constrained, harsher approach took hold. After a slave uprising in New York City in 1712, restrictions were placed on all black New Yorkers, enslaved and free. One, for instance, made it illegal to gather in groups larger than three. Another prohibited them from carrying a cane or stick or owning a gun, and they faced death if they were convicted of assaulting or killing a white person. The international trade in enslaved Africans created enormous wealth in the colonies. Many of the slave ships, who would eventually bring over 12 million Africans to the New World, were owned by American colonists, including some of the wealthy people who settled along the Hudson River. In pre-revolutionary America, European immigration was insufficient to meet colonial labor needs, and African labor filled that shortage. And while the capture and sale of Africans created wealth for the colony, so too did the trade in goods made by enslaved people. New York was the center of northern slavery. It had the largest number of enslaved people north of Maryland. The largest concentration of enslaved people in New York colony was in the Hudson Valley, from New York City up to Albany. They were a significant part of the labor force, reflecting both skilled and semi-skilled labor. They were growing wheat, churning butter, clearing land, and they were involved in other aspects of agricultural work. While some of this production was for local use, a sizable quantity was shipped to market, going out on the Hudson River to New York City and points south, for example, to the slave economies in the southern colonies and to the Caribbean. In addition, and perhaps less appreciated, enslaved people were an important part of the skilled labor force. They were blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, coopers, millers, shoemakers, tailors, and more. And they were domestic workers, handling child care, being coachmen, butlers, cooks, chefs, seamstresses, and more. Westchester, established in 1683 as one of the original counties in the Hudson Valley, was slow to develop. At the end of the 1600s, both white and black population were low, with just a handful of enslaved people working for a similarly small number of white families. But soon enough, richer families began to move and build larger estates across the county. The Phillipses, as you may know, were one of the largest. Frederick Phillips, hailing from Holland and looking to improve his financial and social status, was involved in the slave trade and sent several of his ships on voyages. One, the Charles, can tell us something about the horrible middle passage of these slave ships. On the voyage of the Charles in 1686, over 100 Africans were brought across the Atlantic. About 20% died before reaching the West Indies, and more died on the second leg of the trip to New York. There were only 8 remaining when the ship landed at Rye, and these were escorted over to Tarrytown, where they formed the first of what would be a few dozen enslaved men, women, and children living at the manor. Eventually, with many of the Phillips's tenant farmers also owning 1 or 2 slaves, the entire manor, covering much of present-day Westchester, saw 90 or more enslaved people in the early 1700s, and we're beginning to learn that the number was probably substantially more than that. Just for a little context, the Middle Passage voyage could take anywhere from 25 to 30 days, which is the shortest time we have on record, to up to 3 months or more. And the average mortality rate was 12 to 15% for the entire period, meaning at least 1.5 million Africans died during the voyage. And the mortality rate for the Charles was about 20%. Soon enough, the county was flourishing. Westchester became one of the largest slaveholding districts outside of New York City, though the density of enslaved people varied greatly. One area with perhaps the greatest density early on was New Rochelle, which was a major Huguenot settlement, where in the early 1700s, there was approximately 1 enslaved person for every 2.3 white adults. The need for labor resulted in enslaved people being some of the first settlers in Westchester County. Counting enslaved people among the first settlers is not something you'll normally find in the history books we read at school. Many families who were not among the wealthy landowners and slave traders also enslaved people. Our first aspect of emancipation is rooted in the very beginning of enslavement. Consider that as many 10% of the Middle Passage voyages experienced a revolt led by black captives, even though the price of rebellion was often death. Resistance, of course, didn't end when Africans arrived in the New World. One of the most common forms of resistance was escape from enslavement. In other words, many enslaved people became freedom seekers. This is a good place to discuss vocabulary. The words we use to identify the system of enslavement and the people caught in that system has been evolving for 20 years or more, at least that long. And there is yet no fixed agreement by historians or others on what constitutes the proper vocabulary when talking about this phenomenon. For the system of forced labor or hereditary chattel labor, I use the term slavery or enslavement. Likewise, for the individuals caught in that system, I use enslaved person or enslaved men and women. This choice recognizes the personhood of the enslaved. People who were enslaved had individual lives, families, religion, culture, dreams, regardless of their condition of servitude. In other words, a person's condition of life does not define a person's identity and humanity. Similarly, I use the term enslaver rather than owner. The terms master or owner can continue to suggest a naturalness to the system. It can distance us from the fact that enslavers oppressed other human beings. In the same manner, scholars and local historians also use the term freedom seekers instead of fugitive slaves. Freedom seekers as a term respects the agency, bravery, and righteousness of their flight to freedom, whereas fugitive slaves is a term that tends to lend legitimacy to those seeking return of their so-called human property. Throughout the 18th and early decades of the 19th century, newspapers in the colonies and then the states contained countless notices of men and women, and sometimes children, attempting to escape their enslavement. We are very fortunate to have examples of these ads compiled by different historians. One book, Pretends to be Free, is by Graham Russell Hodges and was published in 1994. More recently, local historians Susan Stesson-Cohn and Ashley Herbert Biagini have compiled over 900 of these ads. The ads cover just the area between Lower Westchester and Albany along the Hudson River. Their book, In Defiance, was published in a second edition in 2023. And together, these two books form an indispensable resource for our region's history. These advertisements tell us a lot about the Westchester residents, brave local men, women, and children who resisted their enslavement. From the Philipsburg and Van Cortlandt estates across all of Westchester, east and west, north and south, people were leaving their bondage. These so-called runaway slave ads can be found for White Plains, Rye, New Rochelle, Harrison's Purchase, Pelham Manor, North Castle, Mamaroneck, Bedford, Eastchester, Yonkers, Salem, Somers, and other towns and estates. The ads tell us that enslavement was widespread throughout the county. Several enslavers have multiple ads, each noting a different freedom seeker. Here's an example of an advertisement from Westchester for Sam. Runaway from the subscriber on the 29th of August last, a Negro man named Sam, aged about 26 years, is about 5 feet 10 or 11 inches high, has black, smooth skin, straight built, and well-limbed, has a scar on one of his knees, can speak both English and Dutch, but sounds mostly of the latter. He's very strong and nimble and does not want for wit. He's very ingenious and understands farming very well. He can play well on the violin and is fond of company. It is likely he may have a forged pass and pretends to be free. All masters of vessels and others are hereby forbid to harbor or carry off the said slave or anywhere to assist him. Whoever apprehends him and delivers him to the subscriber in the manner of Cortland shall receive a reward of $5 with reasonable charges, if taken in Westchester County, and if taken out of said county, £3 with charges as above, paid by John Bryan. To read these ads is to learn something about the people who were enslaved. During the 18th century, prior to the Revolution, the great majority of freedom seekers, as recorded, were male, between the ages of 10 and 50, and the most common months to escape were April through September. However, the American Revolution upended some of these statistics. For instance, and particularly after the issuance of the Philipsburg Proclamation, approximately 30% of those seeking their freedom were women. These freedom seeker ads tell stories that put the enslaved person in the center of history. They give evidence of the enslaved person's agency. These actions toward freedom, these self-emancipations, came long before the united, integrated, and broad organization which has traditionally been given the name of Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad is generally dated to begin around 1830, well after the freedom seekers started their flights to freedom. I call this earlier movement for self-emancipation the Underground before the railroad. The language of revolution and equality and freedom emerged from this European Enlightenment in the period from the late 1600s, early 1700s, and ending around the beginning of the 19th century. The Enlightenment emphasized rational thought over superstition, and it had a potent impact on the movement to end enslavement. During the mid-1700s, both the British and American began a serious questioning of the morality of the system of enslavement. But in America, a major barrier to acting on these questions was the immense profitability of the system in both southern and northern colonies. Moving beyond self-emancipation, though it was always operative for the enslaved, we'll next explore a somewhat unique situation with a major impact on Westchester County. In the late 1600s, Quakers began to move into Westchester. They had a complex and controversial relationship with enslavement. The passage of the New York Quakers from holding enslaved people to finally turning their backs on the practice was a long one. And this will be the second aspect of emancipation. One of the first organized anti-slavery movements began in the Quaker communities of Philadelphia. Quakers established a large influence on the political structure there, and the skepticism toward the religious compatibility of Quakerism and enslavement grew continuously from the 1600s into the 1700s. In the late 1600s, George Fox, the leader of the Quaker movement, began, just catching my breath here. In the late 1600s, George Fox, the leader of the Quaker movement in North America and the Caribbean, responded to a growing discomfort with the system by encouraging slaveholders to be kind to those enslaved, while at the same time exhorting the enslaved to be sober and to fear God and love your masters and mistresses and be faithful and diligent in your master's service and business. Not quite what the enslaved people would be looking for. By the mid-1700s, it's the bigger. By the mid-1700s, Quaker communities throughout the colonies were exhibiting increasing concern over the question of slavery. Pennsylvania took the lead in advocating for the anti-slavery position, but New York was not far behind. And ultimately, Westchester County became a fulcrum of activity for this struggle. Various leaders and anti-slavery advocates were coming to a consensus that the buying and selling of enslaved people should be forbidden, just the buying and the selling. The leading advocate of this position was Philadelphia Quaker Anthony Benezet. Working first to convert the Philadelphia Quakers, his teaching quickly spread to New Jersey, Lower New York, and Westchester County. Benezet's goal was to end enslavement, and he saw the restrictions on buying and selling of people as the first step to that end. As more restrictions were proposed, including possible banishment for those who refused to follow those strictures, Quakers who already owned enslaved people increased their opposition. For them, it was a monetary issue. If they wanted to sell but faced banishment from their local meeting, they would suffer a significant financial loss, which they weren't willing to do. And if they had more work than they or their family could handle, a prohibition on buying an enslaved person meant that their home and wealth might be imperiled. In the early settlement phase of its history, Westchester, as we've noted, was slow to develop. But eventually, the need for land led to European settlers on Long Island, including a few Quaker friends, moving to the mainland. Early on, John Harrison, a Flushing friend, helped lead the way when in 1695, he and 4 partners purchased land from the Native Americans in the area subsequently called Purchase or Harrison's Purchase. And by 1725, Harrison was estimated, Purchase was established as a monthly meeting with members from Purchase, Rye, Mamaroneck, Scarsdale, and they soon had sizable Quaker communities around, and eventually several other monthly meetings were formed. Though Westchester overall was deeply embedded in the slave economy and generally exhibited a pro-slavery stance, within the Quaker community there was a mix of pro- and anti-slavery factions, with the Purchase quarterly meeting being an influential center, such that by 1717, Quakers at Purchase began to question the legality of slavery, that is, legality within Quaker religious beliefs, focusing especially on the buying and selling of men and women, but no official action was taken. While anti-slavery sentiment and arguments continued to grow in New York, it wasn't until 1767 that a push came to outlaw the practice. In 1742, the Oblong monthly meeting was established just north of Westchester, near the town of Pauling in eastern Dutchess County. Along with the 9 partners and other nearby meetings, eastern Dutchess was fast becoming the largest of the Quaker-populated areas outside of Philadelphia. The Oblong members had been strongly influenced by the anti-slavery teaching of John Woolman, also hailing from Philadelphia, and many settlers there were from New England and came to New York with anti-slavery beliefs. Purchase established a strong bond with the Oblong, and when Purchase became a quarterly meeting in 1744, it had oversight of the Oblong. Purchase frequently held its quarterly meetings at the Oblong, and then in April of 1767, the Oblong drafted a series of questions, a query as it was known, with a strongly implied opposition to Friends holding men and women in bondage. When Purchase held its quarterly meeting there in May, the query was presented and discussed. The oblong query, as it has come to be known, was titled Inconsistency of Slave Keeping with Our Religious Principles. In it, they asked Purchase quarterly meeting to provide answers to 5 concerns. 1, is slavery a harm to both slave and owner? Slavery denies the slave freedom to obey his or her inner light. If it's frowned on to buy and sell slaves, why not the same for owning them? Should Quakers free their slaves? And how can we be diligent Quakers and maintain slavery? And with this momentous step, New York Quakers put themselves at the forefront of organized anti-slavery efforts. Purchase wouldn't handle it, saying that, quote, the tendency of this query, quote, was to stir up trouble. But while refusing to take direct action on its own, Purchase did forward the query to the New York Yearly Meeting in Flushing. But Flushing also refused to act on it, tabling it for perhaps future consideration. However, neither the Purchase nor the Flushing hesitancy stopped the oblong. Along with its sister meeting, the 9 partners, they took matters into their own hands and they banished several members for buying slaves and gave ultimatums to other owners to rid themselves of their own enslaved people. It took another 8 years, until finally in 1775, before the New York Yearly Meeting declared that no Quaker should own an enslaved person, with an admonishment that those who did, quote, ought to restore them their natural right as to liberty as soon as they arrived at a suitable age for freedom, close quote. In 1778, they added, quote, the matter respecting those friends that continued to hold slaves being now taken under consideration, it is the judgment of the meeting that such friends as still refuse to free them are to be dealt with as disorderly members, close quote. And despite growing opposition to slavery, it took New York Quakers still almost a century to end the practice in New York. But with their actions, emancipation had taken a big step forward. There is an interesting coda to this story. In 1783, the New York meeting, monthly meetings were directed to visit the homes of the formerly enslaved to ensure that these now free African Americans were being cared for, both in their spiritual and physical needs. And out of this policy, it was common for local meetings to distribute land for homes and or provide periodic assistance to those who had just been emancipated. The meetings were directed to see that groups of Quakers establish schools to be financed by the local monthly meetings. Purchase helped provide a large parcel of land on which settled several emancipated black families from both Quakers and those of other religions. This was situated in the northeast part of Harrison's Purchase, known today as the Hills. And there's an excellent book on the Hills community, tracing its history up through important black soldiers and regiments fighting in World War II who have their roots back in that community. The book is titled Freedom Journey, written by Professor Edith Quinn, and it is well worth your while to look at this book. It wasn't only Quakers who were struggling with the Enlightenment ideas. Those ideas had taken hold of colonists throughout England's American empire, and the hope for liberty from oppression was on the lips of many. But there was no agreement about who would benefit from that liberty and what, if anything, liberty might mean to enslaved black people. In fact, events throughout the 8 years of the war proved that there was a second revolution going on while white Englishmen were fighting white colonists. There was also a revolution in the status, opportunity, and position of black men and women, both enslaved and free. And this second revolution we can consider to be the third aspect of emancipation. If you read early histories of the American Revolution, written by American authors, you will be hard-pressed to learn much about the role of black men, much less women. These histories focus pretty much exclusively on the fight for the American colonies to free themselves from British oppression. Benjamin Quarles, The Negro in the American Revolution, written in 1961, was one of the first to recognize and quantify some of its other important elements. That is, the role of blacks in the war. Today, a little more than half a century after Quarles's work, a leading trend in interpretation is to recognize that the revolution had a profound effect on enslavement. New opportunities for the enslaved included fighting for the British and the Americans. The chaos of the war also opened the way for enslaved men and women simply to run away and try to start their new lives elsewhere. And run away they did. At the start of the American Revolution, approximately 450,000 people were enslaved in the 13 colonies. Some estimates claim that as many as 80,000 to 100,000 enslaved men and women throughout the colonies escaped. There's a huge amount of new research going on in this area regarding enslaved people, free blacks, what their roles were in the war, etc. I will talk about some of that in a few minutes, but it's a rich, rich area for study. The choices enslaved people made changed their lives and those of their families. At the start of the Revolution, enslaved people were working in every northern colony. Historian Alan Gilbert describes the war as the story of, quote, the two revolutions, close quote, by which he means British against colonists and enslaved blacks against their enslavers. But in fact, the enslaved were resisting all enslavement. In this context, it is a misnomer to call Southern and Northern enslaved people who went over to the British as black loyalists or loyalist blacks. Those who were escaping their conditions cannot be considered loyal to the king or parliament, nor likewise even to the Patriot cause. Rather, they were seeking their freedom on the best terms possible. And with the war barely 6 months old, those freedom seekers in New York got a first push emanating from 600 miles away. In November of 1775, John Murray, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, was facing problems on all sides. The British Army in America was in a terrible position. Armed rebels were threatening loyalists. There was a shortage of fighting men and not enough naval power. Murray came forward with a radical plan which he hoped would give his army the push it needed. His proclamation, issued on November 7th, called on all enslaved men who were able to assist in defense of the British cause to join him if they were people enslaved by the Patriots. If they were enslaved by the Patriots. In exchange, they would get their freedom. Murray announced that, quote, "It is my fixed purpose to arm all my own Negroes and receive all others that will come to me, whom I can declare free." You would have noticed that the declaration, tellingly, did not apply to those who were enslaved by the Loyalists. Though focused on Virginia, the proclamation was heard everywhere, and soon enough, Dunmore's policy was adopted in locations across the colony. Its impact on the Patriots was severalfold, which would result in a disrupting of the economies of the Patriots. If the slaveholders lost substantial numbers of their workforce, it would interfere with their ability to produce goods and sustain the rebellion. In addition, the threat of running away increased as news of the proclamation spread, thereby forcing the enslavers to deploy manpower to guard against a potential mass exodus across to British lines. In March of 1776, James Horton of Rye announced the loss of his enslaved man, Will. He ended the advertisement with the caution that, quote, "It is thought he will endeavor to get on board a man of war or go to the king's forces," close quote. Another advertisement, this one for Cuff Dix, shown here, his story is shown here, was the second of these examples. This is also indicative of the new movement. It was not a complete overthrow of the social order of enslavement, far from it. But there was a big dent put in it nonetheless. With the tens of thousands moving across enslavement's boundaries, Dunmore's proclamation is credited by some as, quote, "the first mass emancipation of slaves in American history," close quote. However, Dunmore's tactics also had the unintended consequences of unifying the white Southern slaveholders, both against the British and for the property rights of the enslavers. One South Carolina politician, Edward Rutledge, wrote that arming freed slaves tended, quote, "more effectually to work an eternal separation between Great Britain and the colonies than any other expedient which could possibly have been thought of," close quote. Particularly incensed was George Washington, who called Dunmore an arch traitor. During the Revolution, about 30,000 black men served in the armies, 20,000 on the Loyalist side, and between 5,000 to 8,000 men on the colonial side. Black troops were used both as fighters and as support personnel. This changed from time to time as military leaders wavered between needing troops and worrying about arming black men and how they would be received by white conscripts. Women also often served on both sides, working as nurses, spies, cooks, and in other support positions. There were other consequences. Right after the proclamation was made, the newly formed Virginia Congress responded by threatening the death penalty to people who were escaping enslavement. Also, some patriots freed people enslaved by the Loyalists. However, these newly freed slaves were then sold for profit or put to work to support the Continental armies. In June of 1779, British General Sir Henry Clinton took the promise and potential of the Dunmore Proclamation a step further. Headquartered in New York, Clinton was frustrated by the lack of sufficient troops to help lead him and of a series of protected hatred along the Hudson River. Clinton was frustrated by the lack of sufficient troops to help lead him out of a series of protracted battles along the Hudson River. He saw the value of conscripting both enslaved and free black people. These would simultaneously provide manpower for his army while disrupting the Hudson Valley through a significant reduction of the regional labor force. Issued from Phillips Manor Hall, right where we are, his proclamation had two significant parts. The first acknowledged that the importance of the integrated forces on the Patriot side in New York and other northern colonies. The proclamation sought to stem black participation in the Continental Army by proclaiming that any enslaved or formerly enslaved black person captured in battle would be turned in for a bounty and then re-enslaved. And the second and more significant part of the proclamation promised freedom to any enslaved person of an American rebel who went over to the British side. This provision was understood to include women and children and men who were too old or otherwise unable to fight. And it applied to all the colonies, not just New York. Dunmore's was applicable only in Virginia. Now, whole families could flee to the British lines. It was the largest disruption of the system of enslavement of its time. But it's important to know that, like the Dunmore Proclamation, this new one did not apply to people enslaved by the British Loyalists. Their rights as enslavers were protected by the Crown. And like Dunmore's, as one historian has commented, Clinton, quote, intended to crush a rebellion, not reconfigure a social order. Once the course of the revolution, or over the course of the revolution, black recruits faced changing attitudes, resulting in changing fortunes. Arming enslaved men was not palatable to many whites, enslaved or not, who were already worried about rebellion and insurrection. But the constant need to buttress the existing ranks of the Continental Army meant that there was going to be continuing pressure to recruit black men. In 1775, George Washington banned black men from serving in the Continental forces. However, by the time of his band, many had already enlisted and were serving. For the most part, once black men were recruited, they were not removed from their military posts, and several of their commanders strongly supported them. The need for fighting forces made the participation of black men essential to the Continental Army, and less than a year after his initial ban, Washington changed his order and left it to regimental commanders to decide who and how would be eligible to serve. Rhode Island became a leader in recruiting black soldiers. In 1778, it passed the Slave Enlistment Act that stated that any enslaved person accepted into the 1st Regiment would be free, and that the enslavers would be compensated with cash. Almost immediately, enslaved men from across the state signed up. The success of the 1st Rhode Island and other regiments did not, however, quell the fears of many of the slave owners across the North, and just 6 months after the passage of the Slave Enlistment Act, it was repealed. Afterwards, the regiment volunteers were taken primarily from the ranks of whites and free black men. As the war dragged on, additional provisions were made to enhance the Continental Army. For instance, in 1781, New York passed a law that promised enslaved enslavers free land in exchange for allowing men they had enslaved to serve in the Continental Army for 3 years or until regularly discharged. And for this service, the formerly enslaved men were to be guaranteed freedom. Now, to recap, the conditions under which enslaved men served were varied and often contradictory. Enslavers were permitted to fulfill their own mandatory military service by substituting enslaved men, thereby affording white overseers the ability to avoid conscription. Some of the enslaved men who served were provided freedom when they fulfilled their time of service, and some enslaved men were freed outright before joining the Continental Army. And while many blacks gave their permissions and enlistment bound to their former owners as a payment for their freedom, others were re-enslaved at the end of the war. Let's examine these multiple contradictory positions through the eyes of a few examples from Westchester County. Hercule Sherman was born in Yonkers, but by the beginning of the war, he was enslaved by a man named Jonathan Archer in Orange County. One day, a group of men approached Sherman, asking him directions, believing them to be serving in the Continental Army, and as an act of rebellion against Archer, he helped them. However, the group was in fact a band of deserters from the Continental Army. Sherman was soon approached by a Captain Crane on the Patriot side, who took him into custody for assisting deserters. To prove his loyalty to the patriotic cause, Sherman guided Captain Crane to the location of the deserters where they were captured. Sherman was then recruited by the captain to serve in his company and was promised freedom as a reward. Sherman's pension, of which a page is shown here on the slide, in his application notes his service as a scout near Fort Montgomery, just a stone's throw from where we are this evening, and marching with regiments that engaged the British as far away as Massachusetts. According to the records, he was given his discharge and freedom papers from the Continental Army at the end of the war. When he presented these papers to his former enslaver, they were confiscated and he was re-enslaved. And his saga continued. He was sold several times until in 1795 he had saved enough to purchase his freedom from his final enslaver, one Francis Price, who lived in New Jersey. Sherman took his family back to the east side of the Hudson, and on the census of 1800, he is listed as head of household in Philipstown, which at that time was in Westchester County. A copy of his manumission papers, as I said, is shown here, and years later, when he applied for a pension, and despite corroborating evidence from other witnesses, his application was denied. This was a man born enslaved who persisted in his quest for freedom, for emancipation, within the complicated arena of war for approximately 25 years. He ended up having to purchase his own freedom, and even after everything, he was denied his rightful pension. William Francis and his family had been enslaved by the Van Wicks, a Patriot family in Newcastle near Chappaqua. Learning of the Philipsburg Proclamation, they fled to the British side, and after the war, they left for Canada in possession of a Birch Certificate of Freedom, which was an official document proving a black person was recognized as free by the British Crown. Lydia Tompkins, enslaved on Philipsburg Manor, fled her enslavement in 1776 with her 2-year-old son, Sam. She left for Canada with a Birch Certificate as a free woman. Lydia Purdy, Israel Merritt, and Dinah Knapp, with her 2 children, were enslaved by Sergeant Gabriel Purdy, a loyalist tenant farmer on Philipsburg Manor. All left for Canada, but they remained enslaved because their enslaver was a loyalist. In May of 1783, almost 2 years after the fighting had ended, George Washington asked British General Sir Guy Carleton about, quote, obtaining the delivery of Negroes and other property of the inhabitants, close quote, of the United States. He was referring to the thousands of formerly enslaved black men and women who had taken up with the British. A few days later, Carleton replied that he must keep the promises made by his predecessors, Dunmore and Clinton, to bestow freedom on those who had served for the British. England did finally agree to provide the United States with the names of the black men and women who were given their freedom, as well as other pertinent information. Just the names. Thus we have what's called the Book of Negroes, a list of 3,000 individuals, which included 1,336 men, 914 women, and 750 children, who removed to Nova Scotia and points nearby. It is an invaluable resource for understanding the history of Westchester County, the impact of the war, and for our purposes, how enslaved people used the war to help secure their emancipation. Despite the efforts of resistance, the assistance of Quakers, and the Revolutionary War, full emancipation for enslaved people in New York remained on the horizon. But in 1799, the promise of that fulfillment was answered, even with the enactment of the preliminary Emancipation Law, and in 1827, with finally the abolishment of chattel slavery. Perhaps we should identify these political developments as a fourth aspect of emancipation. And I'll close by again referring to Benjamin Quarles, who notes that the enslaved people, quote, major loyalty was not to a place nor to a people, but to a principle, insofar as he had freedom of choice, he was likely to join the side that made him the quickest and best offer in terms of those unalienable rights of which Mr. Jefferson had spoken. And the best offer, of course, was emancipation. Thank you.
Questions online?
I asked before, I don't see any questions online just yet.
Any questions?
Sure.
So just gonna say, Peter, if you could repeat the question into the mic so folks online can hear.
So 1827 was the New York State law that abolished slavery?
Yes, it was. Yes.
Okay, so,
I'm sorry. The gentleman asked about the 1827 law and what it included. And it included the formal abolition of chattel slavery, inherited slavery. However, there were other provisions leading up to that 1827 which allowed white people to continue to hold and use the services of children of freed women. And the last of those services, we believe at this point, went as far forward as about 1840.
and the actual question is, so was there a compensation of owners? Or how did a revolution not happen right then and there? With owners, with slaves?
That's a very good question. The question was asked, was there any compensation given to New York slave owners in getting ready for the abolishment of enslavement? There was not a direct payment. However, it was worked out to make the abolition abolition didn't become final until about 3 decades. So slave owners had enough notice and time to make provisions to either sell their property in enslaved people, or some of them manumitted their slaves during this time, and some of them had made provisions to actually hire some of their formerly enslaved people to do the same kinds of jobs, but there was no monetary compensation. And in fact, there were even some restrictions. One in particular prevented holders of enslaved people from selling those slaves outside the state. And there are some cases of that involved. So there was no compensation, except that in this case, the children of formerly enslaved women, if they were abandoned, if the owners had abandoned those, they would have to report to the poorhouses in each of the towns, and the owners had the right to take those children back, and for a period of time, the state would compensate them. So it wasn't slavery per se, but it clearly was a condition of confinement and mandatory service. And that, as I say, the best accounting we have now, the last of those children were freed around 1840. There's some investigation still going on about that.
All right, I was asked a question online that I'll pass along to you. Was the policy to offer freedom to enslaved people who joined the fight against the British approved in any formal sense by the founding fathers? So I guess were things like Dunmore, the Philipsburg Proclamation ever brought into the fold by the United States founding fathers?
Well, no, because those were British proposals. Those were not American proposals, if I understand the question correctly. Dunmore was a lord of the British fighting to suppress the American Revolution, as was Clinton. So if I understand the question correctly, the American government did not have any say in those proclamations. Is that satisfy?
I think that's the way the question is being asked.
Yes.
Michael can hear us on here, so he can put a follow-up on there.
Okay, good, yeah.
If I may, there was one situation that's relevant to that question. In New York in 1781, a law was passed that did compensate owners with land if they would release their enslaved people to fight in the Revolution, at which point afterwards those people of the owners who had been compensated would be given their freedom by New York state law. However, it doesn't mean that they were, that
Right.
it happened, but it was a law.
So our friends online can't hear
Oh, they
it. We
can't
can
hear that.
summarize
Okay,
that.
so-
It was a 1781 law.
Well, the 1781 law referred to the Patriot side.
Right.
If I understood the question online, he was asking about authority for the British proclamations. So the American side would have had no role in agreeing or not agreeing to those, because those were measures, those proclamations came from the British side. Clearly, the Americans were opposed to those. But then New York and likely other colonies began to try to find ways to increase their own enrollment because there was such turmoil in the workforce, in the number of recruits that were needed to supplement the armies, etc.
So the person that asked the question says that answers it, and says that the two of you will talk. I'm expecting you know Michael Stoller, perhaps?
I do know Michael Stoller, and thank you, Michael.
And then just a little follow-up from Michael also. So he says, so there was no offer of freedom to those who joined the Continental Army?
Oh, yes, that's a very important point. A very important point. And as was noted there, one of the quotes from the historical perspective was that this was a military measure. It was not a quest to overthrow enslavement completely. So if you happen to be enslaved by a loyalist in Virginia or in New York, that offer of freedom did not apply to you. If your neighbor down the road was a patriot, that offer applied to that enslaved person, but it didn't apply to you. Yep.
Okay. Any other questions? I don't think we have any other questions online. Any last call for in person?
That's it.
No? All right.
Okay.
Come in.
Thank you.
Creep up on. I'm going to come creep up behind Peter again and thank everybody for joining us in person and online. Our next lecture is on December 10th, and it is about the old Croton the Croton Aqueduct. It wasn't old at that point in New York City. So I hope you will join us there. So thank you again, Peter. Thank you again, everybody, and have a great night.
Great. Thank you.